Hey, welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional tales about family and justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our weekly narratives. Now, let's dive into a story that might just break your heart. The Christmas lights twinkled through the frosted window panes, casting colorful shadows across the snow-covered lawn. From outside, the Fletcher family home looked like a perfect holiday card. Warm yellow light spilling from within, a decorated tree visible in the living room window, and the sound of laughter occasionally breaking through the still winter air. But standing in the driveway, Officer Annie Fletcher felt something was terribly wrong. She'd arrived late to the family gathering after finishing her shift, expecting the usual chaotic but warm Christmas Eve celebration. Instead, as she approached the front door, a faint sound caught her attention, something between a whimper and a whisper coming from the side of the house. "Hello?" Annie called out, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees, and the wind chill made it feel even colder. "Is someone there?" She followed the sound, her police instincts taking over as she reached for the small flashlight on her belt. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a hunched figure sitting on a garden bench beside the house. "Oh my God!" Annie gasped, rushing forward. "Grandma!" 84-year-old Margaret Fletcher sat shivering on the bench, wearing only a thin cardigan over her holiday dress. Her hands, spotted with age and blue from cold, clutched a small gift bag. Her lips had taken on a frightening purplish hue. "Annie?" Margaret's voice was weak, barely audible over the wind. "Is that you, dear?" "Grandma, what are you doing out here?" Annie quickly removed her coat and wrapped it around the elderly woman's shoulders. "How long have you been sitting in the cold?" Margaret's eyes, clouded with the beginning stages of cataracts but still sharp with intelligence, filled with tears. "I'm not sure anymore. They told me to wait while they set up a surprise." Annie felt her stomach drop as she checked her watch. It was nearly 10:30 p.m. The family dinner was scheduled for 7 p.m. "Let's get you inside right now," Annie said, helping her grandmother to her feet. Margaret swayed dangerously, her limbs stiff from cold and immobility. "They locked the door," Margaret explained, her voice small and confused. "I knocked, but no one came. The music inside is so loud." Annie supported her grandmother's weight as they made their way to the front door. Through the windows, she could see her parents, siblings, and their families gathered in the living room. Her father, Richard, was pouring champagne. Her mother, Diana, was laughing at something Annie's brother, James, had said. Her sister Patricia's children were playing with new toys on the carpet. Everyone looked warm, comfortable, and completely oblivious to the elderly woman freezing outside. Annie's hand trembled as she rang the doorbell, not from cold, but from a rising fury she had never felt before. The chimes echoed inside, and after a moment her father opened the door, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Annie! Finally! We were beginning to think you'd skip Christmas this year." His words died as he noticed Margaret leaning heavily against Annie. "Mom, what were you doing outside?" The warmth and noise from inside the house spilled out into the night. Annie could smell the traditional family dinner: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, her mother's famous cranberry sauce. The sense that had always meant home and safety now turned her stomach. "You tell me, Dad," Annie said, her voice dangerously quiet as she helped Margaret over the threshold. "Why was Grandma sitting alone in the freezing cold for what seems like hours?" The conversation in the living room died down as Annie guided her grandmother inside. Her mother rushed forward, face painted with an unconvincing look of concern. "Margaret, we were wondering where you'd gone," Diana exclaimed, reaching for the elderly woman's arm. "We thought you were resting in the guest room." Annie stepped between her mother and grandmother. "She was outside, Mom, on the bench in 15-degree weather. Her training as a police officer had taught her to observe details, and now she couldn't help but notice the fleeting glance exchanged between her parents, a look that contained not surprise, but something far more disturbing, guilt mixed with irritation at being caught. "That's ridiculous," her father blustered, his cheeks flushing red. "Mum must have gotten confused and wandered outside. You know how she gets these days. Margaret, still shivering despite being indoors, spoke up. You told me to wait outside, Richard. You said you needed 15 minutes to prepare a surprise for me. The room fell silent. Annie's brother James suddenly became very interested in his wine glass. Her sister Patricia busied herself with her children's toys. Let's get you warm first, Grandma, Annie said, guiding Margaret to the couch closest to the fireplace. Mum, bring some blankets, and someone make her some hot tea. As her family scrambled to follow her instructions, Annie knelt beside her grandmother, rubbing her cold hands gently between her own. The elderly woman's skin was like ice, and her fingertips remained an alarming bluish white. How are you feeling? Do you need a doctor? Annie asked softly. Margaret shook her head slightly. I'll be fine, dear. I'm just a bit cold. But Annie had seen enough cases of hypothermia to recognize the warning signs. Her grandmother's confusion, the slurred speech, the violent shivering. These weren't good signs, especially in someone of Margaret's age. As Diana returned with blankets, Annie noticed something else. A file folder hastily shoved under a cushion on the adjacent chair. The corner of what looked like a bank statement was visible, along with her grandmother's name. Annie's police instincts went on high alert. Something was very wrong in this house, in this family, on this Christmas Eve. And she was going to find out exactly what it was. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Annie's medical training from the police academy kicked in as she monitored her grandmother's condition. The color gradually returned to Margaret's face as she warmed up, but Annie remained deeply concerned. Her grandmother was elderly and frail. Exposure to such extreme cold could have serious consequences. I think we should take you to the hospital, Grandma, Annie suggested, still holding the older woman's hands, just to be safe. Nonsense, Richard intervened before Margaret could respond. It's Christmas Eve. The emergency room will be packed with drunks and accidents. Mum is fine now, aren't you, Mum? Margaret nodded hesitantly, but Annie didn't miss the way her grandmother's eyes darted nervously toward her son before answering. At least let me call Dr. Wilson, Annie pressed. He might be willing to do a house call. He's always had a soft spot for Grandma. I said she's fine. Richard's voice rose sharply. Stop making a mountain out of a molehill, Annie. You always were the dramatic one. Annie felt her jaw tighten. Her father had never approved of her career choice, had never understood why his daughter would choose to become a police officer rather than joining the family accounting firm. But his dismissive attitude now seemed to be about something else entirely. Can I talk to you privately? Annie asked her father, standing up. Kitchen, now. Richard followed her reluctantly, his expression stormy. In the kitchen, Annie turned to face him, keeping her voice low. What's really going on here, Dad? And don't tell me Grandma wandered outside on her own. She may be getting older, but she doesn't have dementia. She specifically said you told her to wait outside. Richard ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, a gesture Annie had seen countless times when he was trying to formulate a lie. Look, your grandmother can be difficult. She was making a scene about the seating arrangements, complaining about the music being too loud. You know how she gets. I just needed a moment to calm everyone down. So you put her outside, in freezing temperatures, for what turned out to be hours. Of course not. I just asked her to step onto the porch for a few minutes. She must have misunderstood and gone to the bench. Then, with all the holiday chaos, I forgot. You forgot your mother was outside in dangerous cold. Annie felt sick. That's your explanation. Before Richard could respond, Diana appeared in the doorway. Everything all right in here? She asked, her voice artificially bright. The kids are asking when we can open presents. We're discussing why Grandma was left outside to freeze, Annie replied coldly. Diana's smile faltered. Oh, Annie, you're blowing this out of proportion. It was an unfortunate misunderstanding, that's all. A misunderstanding that could have killed her. Don't be melodramatic, Diana snapped, dropping the cheerful facade. Your grandmother is fine, and frankly, she's been nothing but difficult since she moved in with us last year. You have no idea what we deal with on a daily basis. Annie stared at her mother in disbelief. So that makes it okay to endanger her life? Nobody endangered anyone, Richard interrupted. It was a mistake. People make mistakes. Annie was about to respond when her phone buzzed. She glanced down to see a text from her partner on the force. "Merry Christmas. Hope your family gathering is less dramatic than mine." The irony wasn't lost on her. Every year, Annie dreaded the holiday drama at the Fletcher household. The passive-aggressive comments, the competition between siblings, her parents' not-so-subtle disapproval of her life choices. But this was something different, something darker. "I'm going to check on Grandma," Annie said, pushing past her parents. Back in the living room, she found Margaret now sitting up, sipping tea, with Annie's niece Emily beside her. At 7 years old, Emily was the only one who seemed genuinely concerned about her great-grandmother's well-being. "Are you feeling better, great-grandma?" Emily asked, adjusting the blanket around Margaret's shoulders. "Much better, sweetheart," Margaret replied with a weak smile, "especially with such good company." Annie approached them, noticing that the file folder she'd spotted earlier was now gone. Her brother James sat across the room, pointedly avoiding her gaze. "Grandma, I need to ask you something," Annie said gently, sitting on Margaret's other side. "Has anything like this happened before? Have Mum and Dad ever left you somewhere or forgotten about you?" Margaret's hands trembled slightly, causing tea to slosh in her cup. "I don't want to cause trouble, Annie. It's Christmas." "You're not causing trouble. I'm concerned about you." Margaret sighed, her eyes suddenly looking every one of her 84 years. "Your parents, they're under a lot of stress. The business hasn't been doing well, and having me in the house is an added burden." "You're not a burden, Grandma. That's not how it feels sometimes," Margaret admitted quietly. "Things have changed since I signed over the house to them last year. They said it would make things easier for everyone, that I wouldn't have to worry about maintenance and taxes anymore." Annie frowned. The family home, the beautiful Victorian where her grandmother had lived for over 50 years, had been in Margaret's name, a gift from her late husband. Annie hadn't been involved in the decision to transfer ownership to her parents, as she'd been deep in an undercover operation at the time. "What else did they ask you to sign, Grandma?" Annie asked, a suspicion forming in her mind. Margaret hesitated. "Some papers for the bank. Richard said it would help with the estate planning, make sure everything was in order for when I'm gone." Annie felt her police instincts sharpen. "Do you have copies of those papers?" "I asked for them, but your father said they were too complicated for me to understand. He keeps all the important documents in his office." Emily, sensing the serious turn in the conversation, slipped away to join her cousins by the Christmas tree. Annie leaned closer to her grandmother. "Grandma, I need to know, are you happy living here with Mom and Dad?" Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "I miss my home, but I'm grateful they took me in. At my age, options are limited." "What about your finances? Your pension, Grandpa's life insurance? You should have been comfortable." Margaret's gaze dropped to her tea. "Richard manages everything now. He says there's barely enough to cover my medications and care. That's why I try not to be a burden. I don't want to be put in a nursing home." The pieces were starting to fit together in Annie's mind, forming a picture she didn't want to see. Her grandmother had been comfortable financially, more than comfortable. The house alone was worth over $1 million in the current market, and now, suddenly, she was dependent on Richard and Diana's generosity. Annie reached for her grandmother's hand. "I need you to trust me, Grandma. I think something's wrong, and I'm going to figure it out. But first, we need to make sure you're safe and healthy." "What are you talking about?" James's voice cut through the room as he approached. "Grandma is perfectly safe here." Annie looked up at her brother, noting the defensive set of his shoulders and the slight flush of guilt on his face. "Is she, James? Was she safe tonight when she was left outside in the cold for hours?" James glanced toward their parents in the kitchen, then lowered his voice. "That was unfortunate. But you don't understand the whole situation, Annie." "Then explain it to me." James ran a hand through his hair, the same nervous gesture their father used. "Not now. It's Christmas Eve. Let's just get through the holiday, okay? We can talk later. But Annie had seen enough in her years on the force to recognize when someone was hiding something. And right now, her entire family appeared to be keeping secrets. Secrets that had nearly cost her grandmother her life. "I don't think this can wait," Annie said, rising to her feet. "In fact, I think Grandma should come home with me tonight." "Don't be ridiculous," Diana said, returning from the kitchen with Richard. "Your apartment is tiny and you're working tomorrow." "I'll call in," Annie replied firmly. "Grandma needs medical attention and a safe place to stay." "She's staying here," Richard declared, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd used throughout Annie's childhood. "This is her home now." Annie felt a cold resolve settle in her chest. "Actually, Dad, I think I need to see those papers Grandma signed. The ones transferring her house to you and the ones giving you control of her finances." The room fell silent. Even the children seemed to sense the tension, their play becoming quieter as they watched the adults. Richard's face darkened. "That's family business, Annie, not police business." "It might be both," Annie replied evenly, "especially if someone has been taking advantage of a vulnerable elderly person." Patricia, who had been remarkably quiet throughout the evening, suddenly spoke up. "Annie, you can't possibly be suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Annie interrupted. "I'm just asking to see the paperwork." Richard's jaw tightened. "Not tonight. It's locked in my office safe, and we're celebrating Christmas." "Some celebration," Annie muttered, turning back to her grandmother. "Grandma, would you like to come stay with me tonight, just until we sort things out?" Margaret looked trapped, her eyes darting between her son and her granddaughter. "I don't want to cause trouble," she repeated. "You're not causing trouble," Annie assured her. "I just want to make sure you're okay." Before Margaret could respond, James stepped forward. "This is insane, Annie. You're overreacting to a simple mistake and ruining Christmas for everyone." "Simple mistake?" Annie's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "Grandma could have died out there." "But she didn't," Patricia interjected. "She's fine. Stop being so dramatic." Annie looked around at her family, the people she had grown up with, the people she had loved and trusted. Now they seemed like strangers, circling the wagons to protect some secret she wasn't privy to. "I'm taking Grandma to the hospital to be checked out," Annie said firmly. "And then we're going to have a serious conversation about what's been happening in this house." Richard stepped forward, positioning himself between Annie and Margaret. "You're not taking her anywhere. She's staying right here where she belongs." Annie met her father's gaze steadily. "Are you sure you want to do this, Dad? Because if you prevent me from ensuring Grandma's safety, my next step will be official." "Are you threatening me?" Richard asked incredulously. "Your own father on Christmas Eve?" "I'm not threatening anyone," Annie replied. "I'm stating facts. Grandma needs medical attention, and I have concerns about her well-being in this house. Those concerns aren't going away just because it's Christmas." The standoff continued for a long, tense moment. Then, unexpectedly, it was Margaret who broke the silence. "I'd like to go with Annie," she said quietly but firmly. "Just for tonight." All eyes turned to the elderly woman, who suddenly looked stronger, more determined than she had all evening. "Mom, you don't need to," Richard began. "I do," Margaret interrupted. "I need some time to think, Richard, and I'd like a doctor to check me over." Annie felt a surge of pride at her grandmother's courage. She helped Margaret to her feet, keeping a supportive arm around her waist. "We'll be back tomorrow," Annie told her stunned family. "And then we're going to talk, really talk, about what's been happening here." As Annie guided her grandmother toward the door, she couldn't help but notice the file folder she'd seen earlier, now visible under the edge of the couch where James had been sitting. In one swift movement, she bent down and retrieved it. "I'll take this too," she said, tucking it under her arm before anyone could object. Her father's face contorted with anger, but he made no move to stop her. Perhaps he knew that physically preventing a police officer, even his daughter, from leaving with a potentially endangered elderly person would only make the situation worse. As Annie helped her grandmother into her car, the Christmas lights on the Fletcher family home continued to twinkle merrily, the perfect holiday facade masking the rot that Annie now suspected ran deep beneath the surface. The emergency room was surprisingly quiet for Christmas Eve. Annie sat beside her grandmother's bed, watching as the doctor examined Margaret. "Your body temperature is still a bit low, Mrs. Fletcher," Dr. Harris said, removing her stethoscope, "and I'm concerned about the early signs of frostbite on your fingers." Margaret looked down at her hands, where the tips of her fingers remained discolored. "Will it be permanent? We'll need to monitor it, but I think we've caught it early enough," the doctor replied. "I'd like to keep you overnight for observation, though. Hypothermia in elderly patients can lead to complications, especially with your history of heart problems." Annie's head snapped up. "Heart problems? What heart problems?" Margaret sighed. "It's nothing serious, dear. Just a minor arrhythmia. The doctor prescribed medication a few months ago." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Your father said not to worry you. You're so busy with your police work, and he assured me he had everything under control." Annie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. "Grandma, have you been taking your medication regularly?" Margaret hesitated. "There was some issue with the insurance. Richard said we needed to be careful with expenses, so I've been taking it every other day instead of daily." Dr. Harris frowned. "Mrs. Fletcher, that's not how your medication is meant to be taken. Skipping doses could be dangerous. I'll make sure she gets her proper medication from now on," Annie assured the doctor, making a mental note to add this to her growing list of concerns. After Dr. Harris left to arrange Margaret's admission, Annie pulled out the file folder she'd taken from her parents' house. Her grandmother had fallen into an exhausted sleep, giving Annie the opportunity to examine the documents without causing her additional stress. What she found made her blood run cold. The folder contained bank statements for accounts Annie had never known existed, accounts in her grandmother's name, but with her father listed as the authorized user. The statements showed regular withdrawals, large sums that couldn't possibly be explained by Margaret's modest living expenses. There were also property documents, not just for her grandmother's Victorian home, but for a small rental property Annie had thought belonged to her grandfather's estate, and for a lakeside cottage that had been in the family for generations. All had been transferred to Richard and Diana Fletcher within the past year. Most disturbing of all was a power of attorney document signed by Margaret, giving Richard complete control over all her financial and medical decisions. The signature looked shaky, uncertain, nothing like the confident script Annie remembered from birthday cards and letters. Annie's phone buzzed with a text. It was from her partner, Marcus. "Everything okay? You usually send a Christmas Eve complaint about your family by now." Annie hesitated, then typed, "Can you meet me at the hospital? I need your help with something. Not an official case. Yet." Marcus's response was immediate. "On my way." "Which hospital?" Annie gave him the details, then returned to the documents. The more she examined them, the more certain she became that something was seriously wrong. The transfers, the withdrawals, the power of attorney, it all pointed to financial exploitation. A crime she'd seen too many times in her career. But this was different. This wasn't some random scammer preying on an elderly victim. This was her father, her mother, possibly even her siblings. Annie rubbed her temples, trying to make sense of it all. Her family had always been focused on appearances, on projecting an image of success and harmony. Had that facade hidden financial troubles? Had her father's accounting business been failing? Even if it had, how could that justify what appeared to be systematic theft from his own mother? Marcus arrived 30 minutes later, his expression shifting from holiday cheer to professional concern when he saw Annie's face. "That bad, huh?" he asked, taking the seat beside her in the small waiting area outside Margaret's room. "Worse," Annie replied, handing him the folder. "My grandmother was left outside in freezing temperatures for hours tonight. When I found her and brought her inside, my family acted strange, defensive. Then I found these." Marcus, a 15-year veteran of the force and Annie's mentor since she'd joined 3 years ago, flipped through the documents with a practiced eye. "Financial exploitation," he said grimly. "And if they deliberately left her outside, that could be elder abuse, possibly even attempted murder if we can prove intent." "They're my family, Marcus," Annie said, her voice cracking slightly. "I can't believe they would. I mean, my dad has always been strict, even cold sometimes, but this—" Marcus closed the folder. "Family or not, what I'm seeing here is criminal. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" Annie glanced toward her grandmother's room, where Margaret slept peacefully for perhaps the first time in months. "I want to protect her," Annie said firmly, "but I need more information before I can decide how far to take this. I need to know exactly what's been happening in that house." "Well, you've got the financial documents, which is a start," Marcus said. "But for the rest, you'll need to talk to your grandmother when she's stronger, and possibly confront your family." Annie nodded, already dreading the conversation to come. "There's something else bothering me. The timing of all this. Why tonight? Why leave Grandma outside on Christmas Eve of all nights?" Marcus considered this. Could be they needed her out of the way for some reason. Was anything unusual happening at the house? Annie thought back to the scene she'd walked into, the champagne, the laughter, the festive atmosphere that had seemed so at odds with her grandmother's absence. They were celebrating, she realized. Really celebrating, like they'd received good news. Dad was pouring champagne when I arrived. Financial good news, maybe? Marcus suggested. Something related to all these property transfers and accounts? Before Annie could respond, a nurse appeared at the waiting room entrance. "Officer Fletcher, your grandmother is awake and asking for you." Annie nodded, standing up. "Thanks, Marcus. I'll keep you posted." "Be careful," he warned. "If your family is involved in something illegal, they might not be above pressuring your grandmother to keep quiet, or pressuring you." Annie thought of the years of subtle manipulation she'd experienced in the Fletcher household, the guilt trips, the emotional leverage, the unspoken expectations. But this was different. This was criminal. "I can handle them," she assured Marcus, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. When Annie entered the hospital room, she found her grandmother looking small and fragile against the white sheets, but more alert than before. "Annie," Margaret smiled weakly. "I'm sorry for all this trouble." "Don't apologize," Annie said, taking her grandmother's hand carefully, mindful of the IV and the discolored fingertips. "You have nothing to be sorry for." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I've been so foolish, Annie. I trusted Richard to look after my affairs, just as your grandfather would have wanted. But lately I've had doubts." "What kind of doubts, Grandma?" Margaret took a shaky breath. "They said the house needed too many repairs, that it was safer for me to live with them. Then there were papers to sign, so many papers. Richard said it was all to protect me, to make sure I was taken care of. But you don't think that's true anymore?" "I know it isn't," Margaret said, a hint of her old strength returning to her voice. "Last week, I overheard Richard and Diana talking. They've sold my house, Annie. They didn't tell me, but I heard them discussing the closing date. January 2nd, Annie felt her stomach drop. "They sold your home without telling you?" Margaret nodded, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "And that's not all. The lake cottage, the rental property your grandfather bought as an investment for my retirement, they're gone too. All of it gone. And tonight?" Annie prompted gently. "Why were you outside tonight?" Margaret's expression clouded. "I confronted Richard this afternoon about what I'd overheard. He denied it at first, then said it was for my own good, that they needed the money for my care. When I insisted on seeing the paperwork, he got angry. Said I was ungrateful after all they'd done for me." Annie's jaw tightened. "And then?" "Then Diana suggested I step outside to cool off while they finished preparing dinner. Richard led me to the bench and told me to take a few minutes to adjust my attitude. He took my phone, said he didn't want me upsetting anyone else on Christmas Eve." Margaret's voice faltered. "I waited for someone to come get me. I knocked on the door several times, but the music was too loud. Or they were ignoring me." Annie felt a surge of rage so powerful, it momentarily took her breath away. They left you out there deliberately. They knew exactly what they were doing. I don't want to believe that, Margaret whispered. He's my son. A son who's been stealing from you, Grandma. A son who left you to freeze because you dared to question him. Annie's voice was gentle but firm. The documents don't lie. I have the bank statements showing withdrawals that can't be explained by your living expenses. I have the property transfers that you may not have fully understood when you signed them. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. What happens now? That depends on what you want, Annie said. We could file charges. Financial exploitation of an elderly person, elder abuse. With these documents and your testimony, we'd have a strong case. Against my own son, my grandchildren. Margaret looked stricken. I couldn't. Or, Annie continued, understanding her grandmother's reluctance, we could try to handle this privately. Force them to return what they've taken. Set up proper care for you that doesn't involve them controlling your life. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering. The house. Is it really sold? Annie squeezed her grandmother's hand gently. I'll find out. If the sale hasn't closed yet, we might be able to stop it. And if it has, then we'll make sure you get the proceeds, not them, Annie promised. One way or another, we're going to fix this, Grandma. Margaret studied her granddaughter's face. You've always been the strong one, Annie, just like your grandfather. He would be so proud of you. Annie felt tears prick at her eyes. I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening sooner. I should have been paying more attention. You're here now, Margaret said simply. That's what matters. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Annie turned, expecting to see a nurse or Marcus returning. Instead, she found herself face to face with her father. Richard Fletcher stood in the doorway, his expression a carefully composed mask of concern. Behind him, Diana hovered anxiously. How is she? Richard asked, his voice carrying just the right note of worry. Annie positioned herself between her parents and her grandmother's bed. She's being treated for hypothermia and early frostbite. The doctor wants to keep her overnight for observation. We've been so worried, Diana said, stepping forward with a bouquet of flowers that Annie recognized from the arrangement that had been on the dining table. When you rushed out like that, stop, Annie said firmly. Just stop with the act. I know what's been happening. I've seen the financial documents, and Grandma has told me everything. Richard's facade cracked slightly, a flash of anger crossing his features before he regained control. I don't know what you think you know, Annie, but this is a family matter, not something to be discussed in a hospital on Christmas Eve. It became more than a family matter when you left an elderly woman to freeze to death because she questioned what you've done with her money, Annie replied, keeping her voice low but intense. That's absurd, Diana hissed. We would never... Save it for the deposition, Mom, Annie cut her off. Right now I want you both to leave. Grandma needs rest, not more stress. Richard's expression hardened. You've always been dramatic, Annie. Always seeing conspiracies and crimes where there are only misunderstandings. But this time you've gone too far. That's my mother you're keeping from me. The mother whose entire estate you've systematically stripped away? Annie challenged. The mother you left outside in dangerous cold because she dared to ask questions? From the bed, Margaret's voice rose, surprisingly strong. It's true, Richard. I know what you've done. The house, the cottage, the rental property, all gone. My savings dwindling with each mysterious withdrawal. Richard's face paled slightly. Mom, you're confused. The medication... I'm not confused, Margaret interrupted. I'm finally seeing clearly, and what I see breaks my heart. Diana stepped forward, her voice taking on the soothing tone she used with difficult clients at her interior design firm. Margaret, you're upset. We all are. Let's not say things we'll regret. Come home with us tonight, and we'll sort everything out in the morning. She's not going anywhere with you, Annie stated firmly. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever again, unless she chooses to. Richard's carefully maintained control finally slipped. You have no right to make that decision. I have power of attorney. Legally, I'm responsible for her care and welfare. A power of attorney obtained under questionable circumstances, Annie replied, one that could very well be invalidated once a judge sees the financial trail you've left. Are you threatening me? Richard demanded. Your own father? I'm stating facts, Annie said. And the fact is, Grandma stays here tonight. Tomorrow we'll discuss how to proceed. If you want to avoid a criminal investigation, you'll come prepared to make things right. Diana grabbed Richard's arm, her expression desperate. Richard, let's go. This isn't the place. For a moment, Annie thought her father might refuse to leave, might escalate the confrontation. Then abruptly, his demeanor changed. The anger faded, replaced by the calculating look Annie had seen throughout her childhood whenever her father was formulating a strategy. Fine, he said smoothly. We'll talk tomorrow. But remember, Annie, family matters should stay within the family. Involving outsiders only makes things messier for everyone. The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Annie held her ground. Good night, Dad. Mom, Merry Christmas. After they left, Annie returned to her grandmother's bedside, her heart pounding with adrenaline and anger. You were magnificent, Margaret said softly, standing up to them like that. Annie managed a weak smile. I learned from the best. You stood up to them, too. Margaret's expression turned somber. What happens next, Annie? I can't go back there, not after this. But where will I go? What will I do? Annie took her grandmother's hand, careful of the IV line. You'll stay with me until we figure things out, and we will figure them out, Grandma, I promise. As her grandmother drifted back to sleep, Annie stared out the hospital window at the gently falling snow. Christmas lights twinkled across the city, marking homes where families were celebrating together, exchanging gifts, sharing love and laughter. Annie had always believed that blood was thicker than water, that family bonds were sacred and unbreakable. Now she wasn't so sure. Perhaps true family wasn't defined by DNA or shared history, but by respect, protection and love, qualities her parents had failed to show toward the woman who had given them everything. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and painful decisions. But tonight, watching over her grandmother's sleep, Annie knew she had made the right choice. Whatever came next, whatever it cost her, she would protect Margaret from those who should have protected her, but had chosen greed instead. Outside, Christmas Eve slowly gave way to Christmas Day, a holiday that would forever be changed for the Fletcher family. Christmas morning dawned clear and bright. Sunlight reflecting off the fresh snow, creating a dazzling display outside the hospital window. Annie, who had dozed fitfully in the chair beside her grandmother's bed, was awakened by a nurse coming in to check Margaret's vitals. "Merry Christmas," the nurse said cheerfully. "The doctor will be by shortly to check on Mrs. Fletcher, but her temperature is back to normal, which is excellent news." Annie stretched, wincing at the stiffness in her neck and back. That's the best Christmas gift I could ask for. After the nurse left, Annie checked her phone. There were multiple missed calls and text messages from her siblings, ranging from James's terse, "We need to talk," to Patricia's more emotional, "How could you do this to the family? On Christmas?" None from her parents. There was also a message from Marcus. "Checked county records. Sale of grandmother's house is pending. Closing date Jan 2. Let me know how you want to proceed." Annie sighed, glancing at her grandmother, who was still sleeping peacefully. The confrontation ahead would be difficult, but necessary. Dr. Harris arrived an hour later, her expression pleased as she examined Margaret. "You're doing remarkably well, Mrs. Fletcher," she said. "Your temperature is stable, and the circulation in your extremities has improved significantly. I think we can discharge you today, provided you have somewhere safe to recover." "She'll be staying with me," Annie confirmed. "Perfect. I'll prepare the discharge papers and prescriptions. Make sure she stays warm, monitors those fingertips for any changes in color or sensation, and takes her heart medication exactly as prescribed." Dr. Harris gave Annie a meaningful look. "Every day, not every other day." "Understood," Annie nodded. After the doctor left, Margaret finally stirred, blinking in the bright morning light. "Merry Christmas, Grandma," Annie said softly. Margaret's face crumpled slightly. "Oh, Annie, what a way to spend the holiday. Hey, we're together. That's what matters." Annie squeezed her grandmother's hand gently. "And you're getting out of here today. The doctor says you're doing well." Margaret nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "I've been thinking about everything, Annie. About Richard, Diana, the house, all of it. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that I don't want a big legal battle," Margaret said firmly. "I don't want to see my son in handcuffs or read about our family troubles in the newspaper." Annie had anticipated this. "Grandma, what they did was wrong," Margaret finished. "Terribly wrong, and they need to make it right. But I've lost enough already. I don't want to lose what little family I have left." Annie understood her grandmother's feelings, even if she didn't entirely agree with them. "So, what do you want to do?" "I want to talk to them," Margaret said. "All of them. Today. I want to hear what they have to say for themselves, and I want to tell them what I expect going forward." Annie admired her grandmother's courage. "Okay, we can arrange that. But first, let's get you discharged and settled at my place." Uta. By early afternoon, Margaret was installed in Annie's spare bedroom, resting comfortably after taking her medication. Annie had stopped at a pharmacy on the way home to fill the prescriptions, wincing at the cost and wondering how her grandmother had managed, or rather how her father had justified withholding proper treatment. Annie made a few calls, first to Marcus to update him, then to her siblings. James agreed immediately to come to Annie's apartment, his tone clipped but cooperative. Patricia was more resistant, citing Christmas celebrations with her husband's family, but eventually relented when Annie made it clear this wasn't optional. Calling her parents was harder. Richard answered on the third ring, his voice carefully neutral. "We were wondering when we'd hear from you," he said. "Grandma wants to talk," Annie replied, cutting to the chase. "To all of us. Today." "I see," Richard paused. "And what exactly does she want to discuss?" "Everything, Dad. The house, the financial documents, what happened last night, all of it." Another pause, longer this time. "And if we choose not to participate in this family meeting, then tomorrow I take everything I've found to the district attorney's office," Annie said firmly. "Financial exploitation of an elderly person is a felony in this state. So is elder abuse. You would really do that? To your own parents, on accusations from an old woman who gets confused about what day it is?" Annie felt her temper flare. "Grandma isn't confused, and we both know it. The paper trail is clear, Dad. So is what happened last night." Richard was silent for so long that Annie thought he might have hung up. Finally, he sighed. "What time?" 4 o'clock. My apartment." Annie gave him the address, though he'd never visited her place, claiming it was in a questionable neighborhood. "We'll be there," Richard said, before disconnecting without saying goodbye. Annie spent the next hour preparing her small apartment for the confrontation ahead. She made coffee, set out the few Christmas cookies she had purchased earlier in the week, and arranged chairs in the living room. It felt surreal to be setting up for such a serious discussion amid her modest holiday decorations. A small, artificial tree in the corner, a few strands of lights around the windows. At precisely 4 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Annie took a deep breath, checked on her grandmother, who had insisted on dressing properly for the meeting and was now sitting regally in an armchair, and went to answer the door. Her family stood in the hallway, Richard and Diana in front, James and Patricia slightly behind them. They were all dressed as if for a formal holiday gathering, Patricia still wearing the designer Christmas sweater from the night before. "Come in," Annie said, stepping aside. They filed in silently, taking in the apartment with varying expressions. Diana's barely concealed distaste, James's studied neutrality, Patricia's open curiosity. Richard's gaze went immediately to Margaret, sitting in the armchair like a queen holding court. "Mom," he said, his voice softening in a way that might have seemed genuine to someone who hadn't seen the documents Annie had found. "How are you feeling?" "Better, Richard," Margaret replied coolly. "No thanks to you." The tension in the room thickened. Annie gestured to the seating she had arranged. Please, sit down. We have a lot to discuss. Everyone took seats, an awkward family circle forming in Annie's small living room. For a moment, no one spoke, the only sound, the gentle tinkling of Christmas music from the neighbor's apartment. It was Margaret who finally broke the silence. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what I want to say to all of you, she began, her voice stronger than Annie had heard it in months. About the betrayal I've experienced, the hurt, the fear. But I realize now that words aren't what matter. Actions are what matter. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Mom, if this is about last night, I can explain. No, Richard, you can't. Margaret cut him off. There is no explanation that would justify leaving an old woman outside in freezing temperatures because she asked questions about her own property. Diana leaned forward. Margaret, you have to understand. We've been under tremendous pressure. The business has been struggling, the children's education costs. So you decided to steal from me? Margaret asked bluntly. The room fell silent again. Patricia looked down at her hands. James stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. We didn't steal, Richard finally said. We were managing your affairs as you asked us to. Managing, Margaret repeated. Is that what you call selling my home without telling me, draining my accounts, cutting my medication in half to save money while you buy new cars and take vacations? Annie watched her family's reactions carefully. Patricia looked genuinely shocked at the medication revelation. James, less so. Her parents' expressions remained carefully controlled. The house was becoming a burden, Richard argued. The upkeep, the taxes. It was too much for someone your age to manage. So you helped yourself to it, Annie interjected, along with the rental property and the lake cottage, properties that have been in the family for generations, properties that Grandma intended to pass down to all of us eventually. James finally spoke up. It wasn't like that, Annie. Dad was trying to consolidate everything, make it more manageable. For whom? Annie challenged. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like he was managing it right into his own pocket. Richard's facade finally cracked, anger flashing across his face. You have no idea the financial pressure we've been under. The accounting firm is barely staying afloat. Patricia's husband lost his job last year. James's restaurant investment failed. We were doing what was necessary to keep this family above water. By drowning Grandma? Annie asked incredulously. Patricia burst into tears. I didn't know about any of this. I swear, Annie, I just thought Mom and Dad were helping Grandma with her finances. I didn't know they were taking everything. Annie looked at her sister skeptically. You didn't know? Even when you got that new car 3 months ago? When you took that trip to Europe this summer? Patricia's tears flowed harder. Dad said it was a bonus from work. He said the business was doing better. It wasn't, James said quietly. It hasn't been doing well for years. Dad's been losing clients to the bigger firms, and when my restaurant failed, he helped me cover the losses. I didn't ask where the money came from. I didn't want to know. Margaret's expression was a mixture of sadness and resolve. So you all benefited from my life savings, from the home your grandfather worked so hard to provide for us, and not one of you thought to ask if I had consented to any of it. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Diana, usually quick with justifications, seemed at a loss for words. Annie stood up, retrieving the folder of documents from the kitchen counter. Here's what's going to happen, she said, returning to the group. The house sale is going to be stopped. If that's not possible, then all proceeds will go directly to Grandma, not to you, Dad. Richard started to protest, but Annie held up a hand. I'm not finished. The power of attorney is being revoked, effective immediately. Grandma will appoint a neutral third party, probably Marcus's mother, who works as a financial advisor, to help manage her affairs. The rental property and lake cottage sales will be investigated, and if possible, reversed. You can't do that, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. The paperwork is legal. Mom signed everything. Under duress and without full understanding, Annie countered. Any judge would question the ethics of a son who has his elderly mother sign away her entire estate while simultaneously reducing her medical care and ultimately endangering her life. Diana looked stricken. "You're talking as if we're criminals." "What would you call it, Mom?" Annie asked quietly. "Taking advantage of an elderly family member for financial gain is a crime. Leaving her outside in dangerous cold because she questioned you could be considered attempted murder under the right circumstances." Richard blanched. "That's ridiculous. I never intended—" "What did you intend, Dad?" Annie pressed. "When you took Grandma's phone and left her on that bench in 15-degree weather? When you forgot about her for hours while you celebrated inside? What exactly was your intention?" Richard had no answer. Margaret spoke up again, her voice tired but resolute. "I don't want to press charges, Richard. Despite everything, you're still my son. But I will never again live under your roof, and I will never again trust you with my finances or my well-being." "Where will you go?" Diana asked, a hint of genuine concern in her voice for the first time. "I'll stay with Annie until we can figure out a more permanent arrangement," Margaret replied. "Perhaps the rental property can be recovered and I can live there. Or we'll find a small place I can afford with what remains of my savings, if anything does remain." James cleared his throat. I have some money saved. Not much, but I could help with rent for a while." Patricia nodded eagerly. "Me too. I can sell the car, pay back what I can." "That's a start," Annie acknowledged, surprised by her siblings' offers. "But there's more. Dad, you need to provide a complete accounting of all transactions involving Grandma's assets over the past year. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every property sale, everything." Richard's jaw tightened, but he nodded stiffly. "And if the numbers don't add up," Annie continued, "or if anything else suspicious comes to light, all bets are off. I won't hesitate to take this to the authorities, family or not." The room fell silent again as the gravity of the situation settled over everyone. Outside, the winter afternoon was already fading into evening, Christmas lights beginning to twinkle across the city. "I think we're done here for today," Annie finally said. "Dad, I expect that accounting by the end of the week. James, Patricia, if you're serious about helping, we can talk about specifics later." Her family rose to leave, a subdued group so different from the celebrating, champagne-drinking gathering of the night before. At the door, Richard paused, turning back to look at his mother. "Mom, he began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Actions, Richard, not words. You've shown me who you are. Now show me who you can be." After they left, Annie returned to the living room, sitting beside her grandmother, who looked exhausted but somehow unburdened. "You did well," Annie told her. "Better than well. You were amazing." Margaret smiled faintly. "So were you, dear. Standing up to them like that, protecting me. Always," Annie promised. "From now on, always." They sat together in the soft glow of the Christmas tree lights, the traditional holiday irreparably changed, but perhaps not ruined. There was honesty now where there had been deception, clarity where there had been confusion, and most importantly, protection where there had been exploitation. It wasn't the Christmas either of them had expected, but as Margaret reached for Annie's hand, there was a sense that something valuable had been salvaged from the wreckage of trust. Something that might, with time and care, grow into a new kind of family. A family defined not by blood or obligation, but by respect, honesty, and genuine care. 3 days after Christmas, Annie sat at her kitchen table surrounded by paperwork. Marcus had pulled some strings with a friend at the bank, and they now had complete records of all accounts connected to Margaret's name. The picture they painted was even worse than Annie had initially feared. Over the past year, Richard had systematically drained nearly $300,000 from his mother's accounts. The house sale, which was indeed scheduled to close on January 2nd, would have netted him another $1.2 million. The rental property and lake cottage had already been sold months earlier. The proceeds, approximately $800,000 combined, transferred to accounts in Richard and Diana's names. "This is extensive," Marcus said, reviewing the documents, "and meticulously planned. Your father created a paper trail that on the surface looks legitimate. If your grandmother hadn't overheard that conversation about the house sale, this might have continued until there was nothing left." Annie rubbed her temples, fighting a headache. How could he do this? How could any of them let this happen? "Financial elder abuse is more common than most people realize," Marcus replied, "especially when it's family members. There's this sense of entitlement, it's going to be mine eventually anyway, that they use to justify taking what isn't theirs." "What are our options?" Annie asked, glancing toward the guest room where her grandmother was resting. "Legally, we have enough here for criminal charges, financial exploitation, elder abuse, possibly even attempted murder if we can prove your father intended to harm your grandmother by leaving her outside." Marcus gathered the papers into a neat stack. "But your grandmother doesn't want to pursue that route." "No, she doesn't," Annie confirmed. "She wants to recover what she can without putting Dad in jail." "That's understandable," Marcus nodded. "In that case, we focus on the civil side. Revoke the power of attorney, stop the house sale, demand restitution of the misappropriated funds. My mother can help with setting up a proper financial guardianship with a neutral third party." Annie's phone buzzed with a text. It was from James. "Found some documents in Dad's office you should see. Can I bring them over?" Annie showed the message to Marcus. "What do you think?" "Worth looking at," he replied. "Your brother seemed genuinely shocked by some of the revelations during your family meeting. Maybe he's trying to make amends." Annie texted back an affirmative response, then went to check on her grandmother. Margaret was sitting up in bed, reading a novel Annie had bought her. "How are you feeling?" Annie asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Better every day," Margaret smiled, "both physically and otherwise. There's something freeing about having everything in the open, even if the truth is painful." Annie nodded. "James is coming over with some documents he found in Dad's office. Are you up for seeing him?" "Yes," Margaret said without hesitation. "James was always the most like your grandfather. Quiet, observant. I believe he truly didn't understand the extent of what was happening." "I hope you're right," Annie said, though she remained skeptical. Her brother had benefited from their grandmother's money as much as anyone, even if he hadn't actively participated in the deception. James arrived 30 minutes later, carrying a leather portfolio that Annie recognized as one of their father's. His expression was solemn as Annie let him in. "How is she?" he asked immediately. "Recovering," Annie replied. "She's in the guest room if you want to see her." James nodded, looking relieved. "I would. But first, I need to show you what I found." They sat at the kitchen table, and James opened the portfolio. Inside were more financial documents, but these were different from the ones Annie had already seen. These were internal records from the Fletcher accounting firm, showing years of declining revenue, mounting debts, and increasingly desperate financial maneuvers. "Dad's been in trouble for a long time," James explained. "The firm started losing clients to bigger companies about 5 years ago. He took out loans, used personal credit cards, even mortgaged their house. Nothing helped. Then last year he was audited." Annie's eyes widened. "An audit? He never mentioned that." "He wouldn't," James said grimly, "because they found irregularities. Not outright fraud, but enough questionable deductions and accounting methods to trigger penalties. That's when he convinced Grandma to sign over power of attorney." Annie flipped through the documents, her heart sinking further with each page. "So he used Grandma's money to save his business and maintain the family's lifestyle. And to bail me out when the restaurant failed," James admitted, his face flushed with shame. "I didn't know, Annie. He told me he had investors, business insurance. I never thought—" His voice trailed off. "You didn't want to think about it," Annie finished for him. "None of you did. It was easier to accept the money, the trips, the cars. without questioning where it all came from, especially when Dad had always been the financial authority in the family. James nodded miserably. "I've been an idiot, a selfish, blind idiot." Annie couldn't disagree, but she also recognized genuine remorse when she saw it. "These documents help us understand, but they don't excuse what happened." "I know," James said quietly. "That's why I brought them, and why I've decided to sell my condo. It's not much compared to what Dad took, but it should bring in enough to help Grandma get set up somewhere nice, somewhere safe." Annie was surprised by her brother's offer. "You'd do that?" "It's the least I can do," James replied. "And I've already talked to Patricia. She's selling her car and some jewelry. Together, we might be able to recover at least some of what was taken." Annie felt a small spark of hope. Perhaps there was still a chance to repair some of the damage, not just financially, but emotionally as well. "Have you spoken to Dad?" she asked. James's expression darkened. "I tried. He's not in a good place, Annie. He keeps insisting he was doing what was necessary for the family, that Grandma wouldn't have needed the money anyway, that she was living comfortably with them, except for being left outside to freeze." Annie couldn't help adding. James winced. "He won't talk about that. I think he genuinely doesn't see it as wrong. In his mind, she was being difficult, questioning his authority, and he needed to assert control. It's how he's always been, just never to this extreme." Annie thought about their childhood, about their father's rigid rules and expectations, his insistence on maintaining appearances at all costs. Had the signs of his capacity for exploitation been there all along? "What about Mom?" she asked. "Blaming everyone but herself," James replied. "The economy, the business failures, even Grandma for being ungrateful. She's as deep in denial as Dad." Annie sighed. "I was hoping that they'd see the error of their ways and make amends." James shook his head. "I don't think that's going to happen, at least not anytime soon. That's why I decided to act on my own. I'd like to see Grandma now," he added after a moment. "If that's okay." Annie nodded. "She's been asking about you." She led her brother to the guest room, where Margaret was now sitting in a chair by the window, watching the winter afternoon fade into evening. "James," she said, her face lighting up despite everything. "Come in, dear." Annie left them alone, returning to the kitchen to continue reviewing the documents James had brought. She could hear the low murmur of their voices, James's occasionally breaking with emotion, Margaret's steady and forgiving. It was strange, Annie thought, how crisis could reveal people's true characters. Her parents, whom she had always respected if not always liked, had shown a capacity for cruelty and exploitation she would never have imagined. James and Patricia, whom she had often dismissed as selfish and superficial, were demonstrating genuine remorse and a willingness to make amends. And her grandmother, who had always seemed somewhat passive and traditional, was revealing a strength and clarity that commanded respect. When James emerged from the guest room an hour later, his eyes were red, but his expression was more peaceful than when he'd arrived. "She forgave me," he said, sounding bewildered. "After everything that happened, she actually forgave me. That's who she is," Annie replied simply. "It doesn't mean she'll forget or that things will ever be the same. But forgiveness is part of who she is." James nodded. "I'll never be able to fully make up for what happened, but I'm going to try. The condo is already listed. I should have the money within a month or two." "And in the meantime?" Annie asked. "In the meantime, I've talked to a lawyer friend about stopping the house sale. He thinks we have a strong case, given the circumstances. And I've arranged for all of Grandma's mail to be forwarded here, so Dad can't intercept any more financial documents." Annie was impressed by her brother's initiative. "That helps a lot, James. Thank you." After he left, Annie returned to her grandmother's room. Margaret was still by the window, but now she was writing in a small notebook. "Making lists," she explained when Annie inquired. "Things I want to recover from the house, places I might like to live, people I need to contact. It feels good to take control again." Annie sat across from her. James seemed sincere about wanting to help. He is, Margaret nodded. He always had a good heart, even when he made poor choices. He was just too much under your father's influence. And now? Now he's finding his own path, Margaret said. It's painful for him, realizing the father he idolized could do something so wrong, but it's necessary pain, I think. Annie considered this. What about Dad and Mom? Do you think they'll ever understand what they did? Margaret was quiet for a moment. I don't know, Annie. Richard has always been stubborn, always believed he knew best. And Diana? She spent her whole life supporting his decisions, no matter what. It would take something dramatic to change either of them now. Something more dramatic than nearly losing you? Annie asked incredulously. In their minds, they didn't nearly lose me, Margaret pointed out. In their version of events, I was just being difficult and uncooperative, and they needed to assert control. The fact that their method was dangerous and cruel doesn't register, because they don't see me as fully human anymore, just an old woman who's becoming inconvenient. The harsh truth of her grandmother's assessment hit Annie hard. That's devastating, Grandma. It is, Margaret agreed. But it's also freeing in a strange way. I spent months trying to please them, trying to be small and undemanding so they wouldn't send me to a nursing home. Now I can stop pretending. I can be myself again, make my own choices. Annie smiled, seeing the spark of independence that had always been part of her grandmother's character, but had been suppressed in recent months. And what choices are you making? She asked. First, I want to find my own place to live, Margaret replied firmly. Something small but nice, close enough that you can visit easily. Then I want to reconnect with my friends from the old neighborhood. I've missed our card games and book club meetings. That sounds perfect, Annie said. And financially? Marcus's mother has been wonderfully helpful, Margaret said. We're working on establishing a new trust that will protect whatever assets we recover, and James's contribution will make a significant difference. Annie nodded, feeling a weight lifting from her shoulders. There was still much to resolve, the house sale to stop, funds to recover, a new living situation to arrange. But for the first time since finding her grandmother in the cold, she felt confident that things would work out. You know, Margaret said, her eyes twinkling slightly, for all the awful circumstances, this hasn't been an entirely terrible Christmas. Annie raised an eyebrow. No, Margaret confirmed. I've discovered which family members truly care about me. I've regained my independence. And most importantly, I've spent more quality time with my favorite granddaughter than I have in years. Annie laughed despite herself. I'm your only granddaughter, Grandma. Details. Margaret waved dismissively, then grew serious again. I mean it, Annie. This situation has been painful, but it's also shown me that family isn't always defined by blood. It's defined by who stands by you when you need them most. As the winter evening settled around them, Annie reflected on her grandmother's words. The traditional family Christmas had been shattered, replaced by something more complex and challenging. But within that challenge, there was also truth, courage, and the possibility of building something stronger, a relationship based not on obligation or appearance, but on genuine love and respect. Outside, the first stars of the evening appeared in the darkening sky, silent witnesses to the small but significant rebirth taking place within the walls of Annie's apartment. 6 months later, on a warm June afternoon, Annie pulled into the driveway of a charming bungalow in a quiet neighborhood not far from her apartment. Flower boxes adorned the windows, filled with bright geraniums and trailing ivy. A small front garden, meticulously maintained, welcomed visitors with a stone path leading to the front door. Annie smiled as she gathered the grocery bags from her car. Every time she visited, the house felt more like her grandmother, warm, elegant, and quietly resilient. Margaret had moved into the bungalow 3 months earlier, after a legal battle that had tested everyone's patience and resolve. The sale of her Victorian home had been stopped just days before closing, thanks to James's lawyer friend and Annie's evidence of financial exploitation. Richard had fought the decision bitterly, going so far as to claim that Margaret was mentally incompetent to manage her own affairs, a claim quickly disproven by independent medical evaluation. In the end, a settlement had been reached. The Victorian would be sold, but the proceeds would go directly to Margaret, not to Richard. James had sold his condo as promised, contributing significantly to his grandmother's new start. Patricia had sold her car and some jewelry, adding a smaller but still meaningful amount to the recovery fund. The rental property had already changed hands and couldn't be recovered, but the Lake Cottage sale was reversed when the buyers learned of the circumstances and compassionately backed out of the deal. Now the cottage provided Margaret with a modest rental income, managed by the financial advisor Marcus's mother had recommended. As for Richard and Diana, they had faced no criminal charges, as Margaret had insisted from the beginning. But the consequences of their actions had caught up with them nonetheless. The accounting firm, already struggling, had lost more clients when rumors of Richard's ethical lapses began to circulate. The family home, heavily mortgaged to support their lifestyle and cover business losses, was now on the market. Their carefully constructed facade of success and prosperity had crumbled, leaving behind the reality of years of financial mismanagement and moral compromise. Annie knocked briefly before using her key to enter the bungalow. "Grandma, it's me! In the kitchen, dear," Margaret called back. Annie found her grandmother standing at the counter, mixing something in a large bowl. At 84, Margaret still moved with surprising grace and energy, especially now that she was taking her medications properly and receiving regular medical care. "Are you baking? It smells amazing in here," Annie said, setting the grocery bags on the table. "Lemon cookies for the book club meeting tomorrow," Margaret explained. "And don't give me that look. I'm perfectly capable of standing long enough to mix cookie dough." Annie raised her hands in surrender. "I didn't say a word." "You were thinking it," Margaret replied, with a knowing smile. "How was work?" "Busy but good," Annie said, beginning to unpack the groceries. "We closed that fraud case I was telling you about. The evidence was solid and the perpetrator accepted a plea deal." "That's wonderful," Margaret nodded. "I'm proud of you, you know, for the work you do, protecting people who can't protect themselves." Annie felt a warm glow at her grandmother's words. "I learned from the best." They worked together companionably, Annie putting away groceries while Margaret finished her cookie dough. It had become their routine over the past months, Annie stopping by several times a week, sometimes just to check in, other times staying for dinner or to help with household tasks. "James called this morning," Margaret mentioned as she began dropping spoonfuls of dough onto a cookie sheet. "He's been offered a position as a restaurant manager. Not as glamorous as owning his own place, but steady work with good prospects." "That's great news," Annie said, genuinely pleased for her brother. "He deserves a fresh start." Since the family confrontation, James had become a regular presence in Margaret's life, visiting often and calling when he couldn't come in person. He had moved to a small apartment, living much more modestly than before, and had started attending financial management classes at the community college. "And Patricia?" Annie asked, knowing her sister's path to redemption had been more complicated. "Still trying to find her way," Margaret replied. "Her husband is resentful about selling the car and changing their lifestyle. He blames everyone but himself for their financial troubles." Annie nodded, unsurprised. Patricia's husband had always been quick to accept the trappings of success, but slow to accept responsibility for setbacks. "She's talking about going back to work," Margaret continued. "Teaching, perhaps? She has her degree, even if she never used it." "That would be good for her," Annie agreed. "She needs something that's hers, not defined by Dad or her husband." They fell silent for a moment. both thinking about the family members who remained conspicuously absent from their lives. Richard and Diana had made no attempt to reconcile with Margaret, maintaining that they had done nothing wrong and had only been acting in everyone's best interests. The last Annie had heard, they were preparing to downsize to a condominium, their finances in disarray, but their self-justification intact. "I saw Dad yesterday," Annie said finally. "At the courthouse, he was there with a client." Margaret looked up from her baking. "How did that go?" "About as well as you'd expect," Annie sighed. "He nodded at me, very formally, like I was a distant acquaintance. I nodded back. That was it." "And how did you feel?" Annie considered the question. "Sad. Angry still, of course, but mostly sad. For him, for Mom, for the family we used to be, or thought we were." Margaret set down her spoon and came to sit beside Annie at the table. "The family we thought we were wasn't real, Annie. It was a performance, a facade maintained at great cost. What we have now, you, me, James trying his best, even Patricia struggling to find her way, this is real, imperfect, challenging, but real." Annie nodded, taking her grandmother's hand. The fingertips that had been damaged by frostbite that Christmas Eve had healed completely, leaving no visible scars. But the emotional scars ran deeper and would take much longer to fade. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," Annie admitted. "Not for Dad's sake, but for mine. Carrying this anger around is exhausting." "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing," Margaret said gently. "It means choosing to release yourself from the burden of anger and resentment. It's something you do for yourself, not for the person who harmed you." "Is that how you've done it?" Annie asked. "How you've forgiven them?" Margaret smiled sadly. "I'm still working on it every day. I forgive, and then I remember and get angry all over again. Then I forgive again. It's a process, not a single decision." The timer on the oven beeped, and Margaret rose to put in the first batch of cookies. Annie watched her grandmother move around the kitchen with confidence and purpose, so different from the hesitant, diminished woman she had become in Richard and Diana's home. "You're flourishing here," Annie observed. "I am," Margaret agreed. "Having my own space, making my own decisions, reconnecting with old friends and making new ones. It's been wonderful. I just wish—" She trailed off, shaking her head slightly as she closed the oven door. "You wish Dad could see it," Annie finished for her. "See that you're happier and healthier on your own than you ever were under his care." "Something like that," Margaret admitted, "though I doubt it would change anything. Richard has always been skilled at seeing what he wants to see, believing what he wants to believe." They moved to the living room while the cookies baked, settling into the comfortable furniture that Margaret had selected for her new home. Some pieces recovered from storage, others newly purchased with the recovered funds. On the wall hung several family photographs, carefully chosen. Annie and Margaret at Annie's Police Academy graduation. James standing proudly in front of his first restaurant before its failure. Patricia with her children at the lake cottage years ago. Even one of Richard as a young man, holding baby Annie, a rare captured moment of genuine connection. "I've been wondering about the holidays," Margaret said suddenly. "Christmas will be here before we know it." Annie felt a small jolt at the mention of Christmas. The trauma of the previous year's holiday remained vivid in her memory. "What about it?" she asked cautiously. "I'd like to host Christmas here," Margaret declared. "Nothing elaborate, just a small gathering. You, of course. James. Patricia and her children, if she's willing to come without her husband. Maybe Marcus and his mother, who've been so helpful." Annie stared at her grandmother in surprise. "You want to host Christmas? After everything that happened last year?" Margaret nodded firmly. "Precisely because of what happened last year. I don't want that to be our last family Christmas memory. I want to create something new, something better." "What about Dad and Mom?" Annie asked, voicing the question that hung between them. Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering. They would be welcome if they were willing to acknowledge what happened and make genuine amends. But I won't hold my breath waiting for that miracle. Annie couldn't help but smile at her grandmother's practical approach. A new Christmas tradition, then. I like it. The timer beeped again, and they returned to the kitchen to retrieve the first batch of cookies, golden and fragrant. As they worked together, setting the cookies to cool and preparing the next batch, Annie thought about the journey they had taken since that fateful Christmas Eve. The legal battles had been exhausting. The emotional confrontations had been painful. The process of rebuilding Margaret's finances and establishing her independence had been complicated and often frustrating. But through it all, something precious had emerged, a relationship between grandmother and granddaughter that was deeper and more honest than before, a small family unit redefining itself based on genuine care rather than obligation or appearance. "You know," Annie said as they finished with the cookies, "I've been thinking about moving." Margaret looked up, concern flashing across her face. "Not far away, I hope." "Actually," Annie smiled, "I was thinking about the apartment complex just down the street. They have a 2-bedroom opening up next month, close enough to check on you easily, but still giving us both our independence." Margaret's face lit up. "That would be wonderful, dear. Are you sure you want to be so close to a meddling old woman?" "The meddling old woman I want to be close to," Annie corrected with a grin. "Besides, it would make our weekly movie nights more convenient." As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting a warm glow over the kitchen, Annie felt a sense of peace that had been elusive since the previous Christmas. The future stretched before them, not perfect or without challenges, but authentic and hopeful. "I should get going," Annie said eventually, checking her watch. "I promised Marcus I'd review some case files tonight." Margaret walked her to the door, stopping to straighten a picture frame in the hallway, a new photograph of herself and Annie taken at the housewarming party for the bungalow. In it, they were both laughing, their faces turned toward each other, the connection between them evident in every line and shadow. "Thank you for the groceries," Margaret said, "and for checking in on me, even though we both know I'm perfectly fine." "It's what family does," Annie replied simply. "The real kind of family." At the door, Margaret embraced her granddaughter. "You saved me, you know," she said softly. "Not just from the cold that night, but from disappearing into someone else's idea of who I should be." Annie felt tears prick at her eyes. "You saved me too, Grandma. You showed me what courage looks like, what integrity means." As Annie drove away, she glanced in her rearview mirror at the little bungalow with its flower boxes and welcoming path. 6 months ago, she had found her grandmother freezing in the dark, forgotten by those who should have protected her. Today, Margaret stood in the warm light of her own doorway, independent and strong, a testament to resilience and the true meaning of family. The Christmas to come would be different from any they had known before. Smaller, perhaps, missing some familiar faces, but authentic in a way previous celebrations had never been. A holiday defined not by expensive gifts or perfect appearances, but by genuine care and respect. In the end, Annie reflected, that had been the most valuable lesson of that terrible Christmas Eve. Family was not defined by blood or shared history, but by actions, by who stayed when the temperature dropped, who spoke truth when lies were easier, who protected when others exploited. It was a lesson written in frost and illuminated by Christmas lights, a truth that had changed everything. And despite the pain it had caused, Annie wouldn't have traded that knowledge for anything in the world. If you enjoyed this emotional family drama that reminds us that true connections are built on respect and protection, not just blood relations, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring more powerful stories like this one directly to you. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.